Hi, thank you all for coming to the Monroe County History Center. I'm Hillary Fleck, I'm the curator here, and it is my pleasure to introduce John Summerlot as our featured speaker for tonight. John Summerlot wears many hats at Indiana University. He is currently a director of emergency management and continuity in IU Public Safety with responsibility for Bloomington and the southern part of the state. He is also an adjunct lecturer teaching courses in the School of Public Health on emergency management and search and rescue. In John's 20 years at IU, he has also held roles in veteran and military services, residence life, and student affairs. John has a passion for IU history and local history. He has served as a volunteer historian and chair of the IU Golden Book Project since 2008. His research on IU history includes numerous presentations and publications. These include a YouTube channel, YouTube famous, with over 50 videos on IU history and a bicentennial lecture series on IU in the Civil War that was presented around the state. In 2020, John was recognized with an IU Bicentennial Medal for his work on IU history. John holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and history and a master's degree in counseling from Mississippi State University. He also has a master's degree in homeland security from the Naval Postgraduate School. Additionally, John has served in the U.S. Marine Corps and the Army National Guard. So thank you for welcoming John Summerlot.
Hi. So to start off with, one of the questions I regularly get is, what is the Golden Book? So I'm historian for the Golden Book. What does that mean? So the Golden Book is actually IU's oldest history project. It got started in 1898 when they tried to document all of the students that were currently serving in the Spanish-American War. And they wanted to keep track of who they were. And that led to the question of how many of our students served in the Civil War and how many students served in other wars before that. And they actually went all the way back to the War of 1812 with documenting this service. And originally just a couple of pages of manuscript that by the time World War I came, the Registrar's Office and the Alumni Association said, hey, we're gonna run with this and we're gonna make this a thing. And it became known as the Soldier Roll of Honor in the President's office. When President Bryan was building the Indiana Memorial Union in the 1930s, he said, you know what, we're gonna put this in a book. We'll have this giant book that people can flip through. And that lasted through World War II when we filled the book. And there was a plan for we're going to get another book, and that never quite materialized. And so about 2008 or so, the project had lain dormant for about 10 years, and it got restarted. And now it is a website, which is also a database, and you can go in and look for folks that served that were IU connected. You can also go in and enter people's names that have since served, so Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, and we encourage all of our veterans that work on campus or go to school on campus today to enter their information. And so you can find, this is very often the place I find the stories that I'm looking at. There's biographical information for a lot of the folks that are in the book. It tells you a little bit about what they did, where they served, particularly if they died in service. So there's a lot of information in there that's quite fascinating to go back and look at. So in understanding the role that World War II veterans played in coming to the university after the war, we really have to talk about numbers to understand it. And this is where my higher ed data side sort of kicks in, and this is going to feel a little faculty for a second, but I promise it'll be interesting. So if you look at enrollment 1930 through 1940 at the university, you can see we started out in 1930 about 3,500 students, and by 1939, 1940, we're looking at about 5,300 students at the university. So, and I see the faces some of y'all are making, like 5,300, that's all we had at the university, 5,300 students, 1/3 the size of Assembly Hall, for reference. That's all we had at the start of the war. And that number initially stayed fairly even in the war because a lot of people don't realize that the draft age for World War II was actually about 20. And so when the war first started, a lot of folks said, I'm going to take a year or two of college before I leave. So initially there wasn't a big drop off. in students. But as the war went on, as the war expanded, more and more people started serving. We started seeing more and more students volunteering, signing up to join. Those numbers started to go up. This is actually a picture from 1953. This is the university, or 1943, this is the university service flag. We had a service flag during World War I, and it had individual stars on it. This time the numbers were already so great that President Wells decided we were just going to put stars with numbers. So that 52 at the top is gold stars. That was 52 IU-affiliated folks that had already died in the war, and there were 5,344 already serving in the war. This is 1943. Now keep in mind the student body in 1940 was 5,300. And now we have that number of people serving in the war. Now some of those, had graduated years before that and everything else. But I think it sort of puts it in perspective as to what that number looked like. This is homecoming 1944, because although we had transitioned and students were starting to leave, we also had a lot of military students that were coming to campus. And there were almost as many folks in uniform on campus as there were folks that were not in uniform. And so as you can see by the formations, it's maybe a little dark here, but as you can see in the formations that are out there, the group in the middle is mostly women. Those are Navy waves that were here for training, in addition to Coast Guard spars and women Marines that were here, mostly Navy waves. But the program was business skills, accounting, all of these sort of back-end services that auxiliary roles provided. The group on the far left, furthest back on the screen, that's actually a program that the Army had here to train folks on foreign languages and other pieces that were deemed critical to the war effort. And then this front group is actually the ROTC program, because we were still training commissioning officers into the military at that point. And you can see how empty the rest of the stands are. So that gives you an idea, all these folks were sitting in the stands, they come out, they do this formation for homecoming, they take this picture, and they go back into the stands, sort of thing. So we had this large military presence, even when our student body had dwindled quite a bit, our official student body had dwindled. It's been said that the returning veteran is not only a responsibility, but he is likewise an opportunity. I'm certain that he offers an opportunity to Indiana University. These veterans will be leaders of Indiana a few years hence. I hope that we will take extraordinary steps to meet their needs. The steps which we must take will be truly extraordinary. It says extraordinary twice in the same sentence. There is no conventional solution to the housing, staff, and curricular problems which must be solved. This is Herman Wells in December of 1945. So 1945, war's winding down. The GI Bill has kicked in by this point. They know the GI Bill is coming. Now, one of the fascinating things about the GI Bill, there were about a little over 15 million veterans that were eligible for the GI Bill. And the estimate was that about 2 million, maybe 3 million, might take folks up on this education benefits thing. They had their education interrupted. They might decide to go to college. Instead, somewhere around 7 million took them up on this. So even budget-wise, Congress wasn't exactly prepared for this because it was way more successful than was ever anticipated, right? So now let's look at those numbers and where they go throughout the war. You can see during the war there's a small decline in actual student body numbers, but by the time 1943 comes around, by the time we're hanging that flag, by the time we're doing that homecoming, the numbers have plummeted. The student body is down to almost half of what it was before the war. There's a slight upturn in 44 as folks are starting to come back from the war by that point. 45, we see this jump, but 46, all of a sudden it gets up there, and by the end of the 40s, we're over 10,000 in 2 years. We went from a pre-war population of 5,300 to a post-war student body of 10,600. So we literally doubled the university in a matter of a couple years. Keep in mind at this point, we had very few residence halls. Most students still lived off campus. Most of our classroom spaces were occupied in some sort of role. There wasn't a surplus of classroom spaces, lab spaces. None of these things were available. But what we had done during the war was put a lot of military infrastructure into campus, and that would come to help us out. Now after this, the numbers go down a little bit in the early 50s, but then quickly rebound, and they just basically keep going up after this to the present day. You know, the idea of, now if you look back at actual statistical numbers of growth, the biggest period of growth in the university was actually from about 1902 to about 1940 or so. It was actually, we tripled the size of the university, and we haven't done that again since then, both in physical structure and numbers. But this big chart here in the middle where this big curve comes into place, that is what the extraordinary effort that Wells is talking about that needed to come into place. 1946 yearbook, we emerged from 4 years of war and rushed almost desperately into peace, remembering back to gayer days. The GIs came home, came in large numbers, and swelled the enrollment, creating new spirit at IU. The new spirit and the old together, let that stand for Indiana University for the year of 46. So extraordinary and new spirit and old spirit are kind of the things that I want you to take forward from those two quotes. So the first question is, where do you house all these people that are coming in? What do you do with this? So this is an aerial photograph from right after the war period of the university. The large building almost in the center is the IU Auditorium. You can see the old 10th Street Memorial Stadium there on the corner. You're looking eastward from here. So you'll notice there's a few buildings. Those are actually military housing that was built by the Army during the war. That's where a lot of the SATC students stayed at. There's also a cluster of military housing that is over on this side. That is today roughly where the School of Ed and Forest residence halls are located. Spruce Hall is in that area. Those were actual military buildings that were built during the war, and the military basically said, well, the university can have them. We're done with them. They're yours. We didn't actually own a lot of that land. The Army was renting that land from local farmers, which then led into a lot of the university's land purchases because the farmers were like, I don't want it back. So there's also a cluster of military buildings that you can see there that was originally known as Rogers. That was Rogers 2, because Rogers 1 was located just above that. Let me go forward here. This actually photograph was taken far enough back. That is what most people that grew up here probably know as Ashton Residence Center, or Old Ashton. It got torn down in 2010. It's where Union Street Center is today. It was originally called Rogers 2, and this is Rogers 1, which was military housing. It was all built on the Rogers farm, so they just took this simple name for doing it. This is Wright Quad, which was our first attempt at building a building, and to give you an idea of how the military production scale came in after the war for things, the idea of building a residence hall, a stone building that could house 1,000 students, went from, can we do this, to built in just over 2 years. So the average runway on a residence hall project today is about 8 years, I think. But in 2 years, they went from Herman Wells going, we got to build new residence halls to put these folks in, to built and people moving into it. In fact, people moved into it before it had a name. Because they hadn't even named it yet because they were in such a hurry to get it done. So that gives you a little bit of idea. Now, one of the other things that happened after the war is a guy named Ward Biddle, who was the vice president of IU at the time. The conference center at the Union is named after him today. Ward Biddle drove around to all these military bases that were starting to decommission things, and he said, oh, hey, you got a building you don't need anymore? Looks small enough. Let's put it on a trailer. And they would drive buildings from Camp Atterbury, from Benjamin Harrison, from Fort Knox, from wherever he could get a hold of one. He would buy these military surplus buildings. Sometimes the buildings were big enough they actually had to collapse them and lay them down on the truck and drive them here and then set them back up. But one of his big favorite things was trailers. Anywhere that he could find trailers, he would load trailers onto a flatbed and he would get them here to campus. And so you'll start to see these little communities of trailers pop up. Woodlawn Courts is down here on this side of the stadium. It's a little out of the picture, but we got another picture we'll show here in a second. This is actually one of the buildings. This is where Lilly Library is today. This was actually built during the war, and we took it over as an academic building after the war as part of our expansion. How desperate were we for housing space? I'll come back to trailers in a second. Anybody recognize this room or know what space this is? Nope. This is actually the President's Conference Room in Bryan Hall.
Something with the president's
Yeah.
space.
Herman Wells literally gave up his conference room to how there's no showers, there's no bathrooms. Well, there's bathrooms, but they're down the hall. And one of the veterans that lived here during that time actually said later on, the best thing about living here was that every morning the president's secretary would make coffee and bring them all coffee. Yeah. So they literally, it's about, I've walked it, it's probably about 20 feet from the entrance to this conference room to the president's office. So they were literally right there after the war. And some folks got so desperate, Charles Montfort bought the plans for 3 chicken coops and then built his own house. This is the level of desperation that veterans were getting to in order to find housing during this time. Now, that 3 chicken coop house that he built is about 3 times the size of a trailer. So when we talk about the trailers later, just keeping in mind, this was a luxury facility that he was building, yeah. So the trailers. So this is a picture of Woodlawn Courts. You can see Collins Residence Center in the background back there. So this is taken from the stadium side looking west. Couple of things to point out in this picture. So this is a year and a half into the trailer courts being there. You can tell by the size. The original section was just a small one on the top end there. Notice the electrical lines. One of the challenges that came with putting in these trailer courts was building the infrastructure, putting in the electrical, putting in the water. Even though there wasn't running water to these trailers, they still had to run water to the laundry rooms, the bathrooms, the other pieces of it. Then there was a logistical challenge of getting literally ice delivered to the ice boxes every day, of getting milk delivered to all of these trailers, because most of these trailers had children that lived in them at that point. Doing laundry. So earlier we were walking through the exhibit upstairs, and my mom was reading one of the signs, and it said that there was a washing machine for the whole community. And I was like, I think this was early on, because they definitely added more laundry facilities later. So, but yeah, managing this side of the infrastructure of these communities, which we'll come back to in a second, because the reality of it is it was so large, the university couldn't manage the infrastructure of every single facility without help from the students. And that's the first time that's happened. This is the first time the university says, students have to step up and sort of take a role, or you're just gonna have to do this on your own and figure it out type of thing. And so veterans housing became a real impetus for the push towards residence hall government and residence hall associations that we know. So this is the map of Woodlawn Courts. What I love about this map is it shows that infrastructure piece. So you've got the blue lines that are the electrical, on this map I think electrical is purple. There's blue lines that are the water lines that run through there. This all gets built into what is today the rec sports field across from Collins. And every community that we put trailers into, we had to do this. So the trailers that were there, so here's an overhead shot. This is actually the 17th Street Memorial Stadium. This is a later photo. 17th Street Stadium is up there at the top, but you can see here that we had a group of trailers roughly where IU Credit Union is today. We had a whole set of trailers. These are actually the longest lasting ones. Whenever I talk to people that grew up here, these are often the trailers they remember, the ones that were today behind DeVault Alumni Center between 17th and 13th. In that area, those were the longest lasting ones that made it. We had a group of trailers there. Again, we have to run infrastructure. We had small isolated groups of trailers that we had to run infrastructure to as well in order to set these up. So Woodlawn Courts, although it was the first and it was the one that everything was modeled after, wasn't our only trailer community. You can even see a little one off to the side over here. And I don't even know that one may not even have been ours. That may have been a private one. But I saw it on the map and I was like, I've never even heard of that one before. My favorite trailer community wasn't even anywhere near campus. So this is actually down where Templeton Elementary School is today. That used to be an IU property. It was a farm homestead. In the bottom left corner, you can see a big black square down there. That was the farmhouse. The university owned this from before World War I, and during World War I, we used the farmhouse as a hospital for Spanish influenza, students with Spanish flu. But this area, Templeton I think actually takes up a smaller space today than what this is. But this was another trailer community that we built and put together as a part of the housing. And then other places like businesses in downtown were taken over as a part of the housing. And so this was actually a business. It's today the parking garage in downtown, directly behind Serendipity Martini Bar, which used to be the VFW, was the VFW at that point. And Townhouse, as it was just called, because we didn't give them real creative names, was specifically built as university veteran housing. And veterans literally lived in what was previously a shop. I mean, they just made it work. They put bunk beds in there. I mean, they were used to improvising from the war effort anyway. My favorite part of the advertisement for living in Townhouse was that it's only 20 feet from the VFW. And so if you like to hang out at the VFW and have a beer at the end of the day, this was your spot. This was your place to go. Some of the changes that came with the veterans, in addition to just the sheer number, this is the first time that we had married students in large numbers. Keep in mind that married women all the way through the 1920s generally were not allowed to be students. It was an exception when a married woman was allowed to be a student. The assumption was once you got married that you were going to have children and you were not going to contribute to the workforce, so why would we let you go to school? And that wasn't just an IU thing, that was a lot of places in the country. And so all the way through the 20s, you can read these stories about women that there were secret marriages that happened when students decided they wanted to get married and they wanted to run off after graduation together. They would get married in the spring and not tell anybody so that she would be allowed to graduate. But we certainly, I can only find one documented case of a woman with a child that was a student prior to that. Now, we very proudly named a building after her. Meady Hawkins Everman was not only our first married student, she was also, to graduate, she was also our first mother that we know of that graduated. And there's actually a great photo of her son with her at graduation that's out there. So, but bringing children to campus, bringing your family to campus with you was a bit of a challenge. And in these trailers especially, as you can see by the size, the space was very limited for what you could do and what you might have set up. Women cooperated and built cooperative daycare centers so that they would be able to go to class, so they would be able to take classes, they would be able to go to church, so they'd be able to go do whatever other errands, things they needed to do. The cooperative daycare centers that came up out of this were our first daycare centers on campus. And so they would very often take over a community building or a trailer to put in a nursery. The veterans themselves would build playground equipment that would then be a part of that area for it. So many of these are home-built playground equipment, things that today would never pass any sort of safety inspection. They probably had lead paint, I'm sure, too. But this was part of the idea of the veterans saying, we need this infrastructure in order to do this. And the university basically said, if you can make it happen, you do it. So they would do it. They got creative. This is actually the grocery store, the cooperative grocery store that they had put together in Woodlawn so that they could buy groceries in bulk and then people could come. There wasn't a lot of storage room. So if you might have a couple of days worth of groceries in your trailer at most. So every couple of days you need to go to the grocery store. But they also didn't have cars. They didn't have a means to do. So setting up their own grocery store, their own cooperative purchase system really worked well for them, and several of these popped up around campus during that time. Representation. So right after World War I, we actually had an American Legion post on campus. We were one of the first schools in the country to have an American Legion post on campus. By the time the veterans cycled through and left, that post died out. After World War II, we got more veterans that came to campus, and so we got a new veterans group. So the American Veterans Committee was a veterans group after World War II that lasted through the 60s or so before it sort of fell apart. But it was, at the time, basically the student veterans organization for the country. And they were really popular on college campuses. Now, one of the things that's important to point out here, and we'll come back to this in a second, you'll notice there's at least one, maybe two individuals that appear to be African American. Interracial organizations on campus were largely unheard of. There was actually one committee on campus that was the Student Religious Committee's Committee on Interracial Relations. And that was the only obviously interracial committee on campus prior to the war. But then after the war, veterans are coming back and they're saying, hey, no, this guy's a veteran like me. I have more in common with him than I do with the typical student. They were willing to do these sort of things on that side. We also had an American Legion post on campus named after Ernie Pyle. So we rechartered that post. And noticeably, there are two women that are involved with this post. The American Legion did allow women into as members that had served during the war. We had a large number of women that served during the war that were IU alums or then came to IU. Now, I've been asked before, I don't know out of the married couples that came to IU how many of the women were eligible for GI Bill or how many of the women were taking classes. We just don't have numbers to sort of support that or say anything about it. It wasn't a lot of them. There were some, but there weren't a whole lot of them. Many of them were consumed with supporting their husbands that were pursuing the education. So this representation piece and understanding student organizations as we think of them today didn't particularly exist. There were some, but there weren't a lot. So in 1895, our very first student organization that involved sort of student government, that's not a fraternity or a sorority, is the Association of Women Students. And that was formed to help women students acculturate in a place where they were still about 3 to 5% of the student body. Also offered an opportunity for women faculty and spouses of faculty members to mentor, to get to know them, to work through things with them. 1909, the Union Board gets created, and the idea behind the Union Board is it's the union, it's the student union. It represents all of the students. Only the Union Board didn't allow women to participate, and they didn't allow African Americans to participate, so it wasn't exactly representative. 1952, the Association of Women Students actually merged with the Union Board, and that was the point when the Union Board became coeducational. So that didn't happen until much later. 1909 through 1930, you start to get Greek councils. So the Greek organizations start to form into the National Panhellenic Council, the NPHC, which is the historically black Greek organization council. You start seeing these groups start to pop up, but they're only regulating the Greek students. You also have the ROTC battalion. So people forget that ROTC was required class for all freshmen and sophomore men from 1917 through 1964. So the ROTC battalion was a form of student government. It could discipline people for student behavior issues, even if it wasn't during ROTC class. All students were a member of it, and if you were making bad choices and going out and running naked down the street or getting drunk on the weekends or whatever, you could face punishment for that. So it was a form of regulation. 1912, there's a student council that's formed, and I think it's a great argument as to whether or not it is the student council. At the time, the student council's job is to advise the faculty council. So they're not governing the students as much as they're just advising the faculty council. But in 1944, they become the student council in their own right. And at that point, they take on the role of advisor to the president, advisor to the university about what it is that they're doing. So this is a wartime sort of thing that happens as a piece of that. 48, they become called the Student Senate. 67, they become student government. 74, they become the Student Association. And then in 2018, they went back to being student government. I'm assuming somewhere after this, they'll become the Student Senate again, and we'll just keep going up and down the line. So this is student government as we know it. Now, student government, as you can probably imagine, and if you've been to IU, you've sort of lived through this, is largely dominated by the fraternities and the sororities. It's dominated by what I would call the traditional age students. And the veterans show up in the middle of this. And when the veterans show up in the middle of all of this traditional age student stuff, by the way, they're all exempted from ROTC. They don't have to be in ROTC. So none of this government really feels like it applies to them in any way, shape, or form. And so early on, they start looking at the men's and women's residence center. So women's residence center was Memorial Hall, Goodbody, Morrison, Sycamore. And then the men's residence center was what we know today as Collins Living Learning Center. And so they looked at those two and they said, that's more like what we want. We want somebody that sort of looks out for our issues, and our issues are different than everybody else's. So in 1946, they formed the Council of Woodlawn Courts, and they elect the mayor of Woodlawn Court to lead them. Very quickly, all the other trailer communities follow suit on this. They elect a mayor, and this is the group that is responsible for, hey, we need more washing machines. Hey, we need to set up this co-op grocery. Hey, here's the rules for the daycare. All of these sort of things that are running through them, and they're really operationalizing their communities in ways that didn't exist before that. They start putting pressure on the Student Senate. So Student Senate, when it gets formed, is they say, we're going to have representatives from Men's Residence Center. We're going to have one from the Women's Residence. And they said, well, hey, what about us? What about Woodlawn Courts? What about the veterans? Where's our representation on this? And keep in mind, there's a culture pressure between Joe Veteran and Joe College about what is sort of going on at this point. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But they're successful in that, and they actually get seats in the Student Senate. Years later, 1956, when the Residence Hall Association was formed, to represent all of the Residence Hall students, they're able to then integrate with student government, not just the veterans, but all of the other groups as well. And that's really a push that comes from the veterans to make student government more inclusive, to make student government more representative. So this idea of Joe Veteran versus Joe College, this is the Council of Woodlawn Courts in 1946. This is the Union Board in 1946. And I'm going to show these two pictures over each other so that you can sort of look at them. Union Board, which is on the bottom, Joe College. These are your traditional age students for the most part. These are students that came of age too young to go into the war. These are, 18 to 20-year-olds at that point as the war is starting to wind down. Your top picture, your Council of Woodlawn Courts, is your veterans that have returned. So you'll notice some differences if you look at this picture long enough. One of them that might stand out to you is simply the fashion. So you'll notice the veterans aren't wearing suits. They aren't wearing ties for the most part. They're wearing sweaters. They're more casual about life, whereas all of the Union Board folks are decked out in suits. You'll also notice that the veterans seem just a little more comfortable in who they are. They're a little more relaxed in the photo for the most part than a lot of the folks in the Union Board photo. This is part of that culture difference. When the veterans came back and the Union Board folks said, hey, we want to do things this way, they said, nah, I don't need to. I've been there, I've done that. I just spent 4 years overseas. I don't need to be a part of that. And really blew off some of these norms. This was fairly widely known at the time, and so Willie Gillis, who is a Norman Rockwell figure that was painted throughout the war, there's all these pictures of Willie Gillis's war experience that get run in the Saturday Evening Post. And throughout all of these, you can see Willie Gillis has a particular look to him, which I would call as a slightly awkward 19-year-old, right? Like that's kind of who 19, 20-year-old, that's who he is depicted as throughout. I think there's 7 total Willie Gillis paintings, and in 6 of them he is depicted this way. The final of the Norman Rockwell Willie Gillis's is Willie Goes to College. And now here, suddenly, Willie seems a lot older, a lot more mature. You'll notice there's some symbolism here. He's got his helmet hanging above the window up there. He's got his Army discharge on the left side, just kind of half off of the screen. And back here, where Willie Gillis is generally a private, by the end of the war, Willie Gillis is a master sergeant. You can tell by the chevrons on the side over there. He's seen stuff. He's been places. He is seen in a very different sort of light than the folks that he was before. He also picked up a pipe somewhere along the way, right? So this culture clash between the two comes out in defying cultural norms. When the veterans get back here, they say, we don't want to do that silly stuff that you make 18-year-old freshmen do. I'm a 24-year-old combat veteran. I'm too cool for that. I'm too old for that. So one of the things that died out fairly quickly was the tradition of the freshman beanie. So all of the freshman men for the 6 to 8 weeks at the start of the fall semester, sometimes through the full fall semester, were given a green beanie to wear, mostly so that everybody could make fun of them and know that they were lost and confused and a freshman on campus and all of these sort of things. But very quickly the veterans said, yeah, well, I'm not doing this. I'm not a part of that. And people didn't want to argue with them, so they said, okay, that's fine. The veterans also, because they ran their own housing, decided some very basic things like, hey, this is open to all veterans. We don't care what color you are. So interracial housing became a thing with veterans well before it did for any other student group on campus, including our own residence halls. Traditional Joe College black students that were coming at that point were still forced to live off campus. They didn't get to live in the residence halls. But instead, black veterans were allowed to live in the residence halls with the other veterans, or the trailers, or the converted spaces, or any of those sort of places they could get into. Now, one of the other things that's fascinating about the veterans housing is it wasn't just veterans that lived in the housing. And this is sort of like over time, I kept thinking like, well, the veterans would eventually run out, but like we kept doing veterans housing. At some point, they had to have integrated. Like there had to have been non-veterans that came and lived in the trailers or lived in these spaces. I was interviewing an alum who had graduated in '51, and he had come here as an 18-year-old freshman in '47, '48. His brother was a World War II veteran, his oldest brother. And when he came in as a student, his oldest brother said, oh yeah, you're not living with those other freshmen and wearing that beanie and all that stupid stuff. You're gonna come live in veteran housing with us. And so as an 18-year-old freshman, he was living in veteran housing with a bunch of 22 to 27-year-olds and learning probably some questionable habits from them in the process. Now he graduated, went on to serve in Korea, in the Army in Korea. But you know, he attributes that experience to really helping him get through college because he didn't have to go through all the freshman sort of hazing and pieces. He had these older mentors and guides that kind of helped him out. On the race relations piece, it's also notable that during the war, one of the traditions that developed with the Navy on campus was that the Kappa Alpha Psi, historically Black Greek organization that was founded here on campus, had an annual baseball game that they played with the Navy. No other fraternity would play them. So no other white fraternity would play them. So very often when their baseball team wanted to play a baseball game, they either had to play local African Americans, typically from Showers Furniture Manufacturing. They had a black baseball team, and so they would play them, and they'd have to travel. They'd have to go to Indianapolis or Louisville or someplace else if they wanted to play a game against somebody. But the Navy said, nope, we'll play, that's fine. And so you had an all-white Navy team playing an all-black fraternity team during that time. And this became an annual tradition that they did each year during the war. Japanese American students had been banned from the university during the war. That included one Japanese American staff member who worked at the university and tried to sign up for classes, and they would not allow her to sign up for classes. So after the war, there was a conversation, and it's documented, of folks saying, well, are we going to ban Japanese American veterans from the university? And Herman Wells kind of led the charge and said, we're not going to ban any veteran from the university. And through some faculty members very intentionally sort of finding Japanese American veterans that would come to the university, we enrolled our first two Japanese American veterans, Ted Tsukiyama and Kiyoshi Oda, during that time. Ted actually has a great book that he wrote about his life and his experience after he finished at IU. He went on to Yale and became a lawyer and then became a civil rights lawyer in Honolulu for the rest of his life. Ted actually served with the University of Hawaii ROTC unit in 1941 in December when he was a freshman in college in Hawaii at that time. And one of the fun, interesting stories, the University of Hawaii ROTC program is the only ROTC program ever credited with a combat award. So December 7th, after the attack, they were actually put on guard duty because the assumption was that the island was about to be invaded. And they actually spent about 2 weeks on guard duty, armed, ready to repel an invasion after the war, because there wasn't a lot of National Guard or Territorial Guard at that point in Hawaii. So they actually served in technically a combat role. He served with that. Then he was banned from being in the Army because we didn't want Japanese Americans in the Army. So he served the Japanese Volunteer Force, the Triple V Victory Group in Hawaii, until they allowed Japanese Americans to serve in Europe. And he joined the Army at that point, and then went and served in the Army in Europe, and then came back and went to IU. And I already told you kind of the rest of it. Kiyoshi Ota was fascinated with photography. I believe he actually did not have a career in photography. I don't remember what he did, but he was an amateur photographer for the rest of his life. And I found it ironic that the one picture that we have of him that was in the yearbook is him with a camera. So these veterans then began to create some legacies, and they didn't intentionally sort of do this, but they brought a different idea, a different mindset to how things were happening. And there's things at the university today that we can still look back and accredit them for, or point out for them. Colonel Raymond Schumacher, during the war, he was the military commander at IU. He was responsible for all military forces. He was technically the professor of military science, but he was the senior officer in charge of all military forces at IU, Navy, Air Corps, everybody that was there. He made good friends with Herman Wells during that time, as you can probably imagine. After the war, he retired. And prior to the war, we had a dean of men, we had a dean of women, and their very segregated sort of responsibilities that happened, but Colonel Shoemaker was in charge of all military personnel, men and women, that were here. And Wells really liked that idea. He liked the idea of having one person that was in charge of, instead of having a dean of men he had to deal with for men's issues, and a dean of women, who also, by the way, very often were at odds with each other about what needed to happen for students. And during the war, he had this third person that was responsible for all the military personnel. So he said, you know what, I'm going to solve that problem. And he brought Raymond Shoemaker back as Dean of Students, our very first Dean of Students. And he put the Dean of Men and the Dean of Women underneath him. And at one point, we even had two Dean of Men because there was a separate one for athletics. And much of what we do today, student conduct-wise, student affairs, all of that can largely be directly attributed back to Dean Shoemaker when he was here. And so that became his post-military career, was to do that. Also, it helped when all the veterans came back, and the veterans would cause problems, and they would sort of listen and respect him, so it worked. Howdy Wilcox. So if you aren't familiar with Howdy Wilcox, that's okay. It's surprising how many people on campus don't know this name. They may know Wilcox House on campus if they know something. So Howdy Wilcox served in World War II. He was an alum. He graduated before the war. And after the war, he got brought back with the Alumni Association and doing some volunteer work at the foundation and all of these things. He was a marketing guy. That was his thing, was to do marketing work up in Indianapolis, had a great career in marketing, also served in the National Guard, eventually retired as a Major General. But the real key to Howdy Wilcox was that one day he was watching some students, and it seems pretty likely they may have been veterans, that were doing bicycle races around the residence halls, the converted barracks. And he got an idea. Remember, he's a marketing guy. He got an idea. He said, what if we had a race? Yeah, the other key piece of this, Howdy Wilcox is actually Howard Wilcox Jr. His dad, Howdy Wilcox, had won the Indy 500 back in the 19-teens and was a race car driver. So Howdy Wilcox had the idea of, what if we had a bicycle race that was kind of like the Indy 500, and we raised money for student scholarships from that? Again, veteran connection. Yep, sounds great, right? Maybe someday it'll be like the greatest college weekend. You never know, right? So so Howdy Wilcox was responsible for that and saw it through for much of its early life. That piece of veterans bringing their families, really opening the university up to non-traditional students, that can bring their families and other things with them has continued ever since then. We still have family housing, we still have options, and nowadays oftentimes we think of it for graduate students, but we still do it for undergraduate students as well. And that went on, really largely got handed off to veterans of the Korean War and other veterans. Along that note, along came a guy named Corporal David Moore. And so David Moore came here in 1954 after having served in the Army in Korea and in Japan. While he was after Korea, he served in Japan with the Army of Occupation, and there he met a woman and eventually married to Zuko. She went by the American name of Marie when they came here. And so David and Tezuko came here and had two children, Christine, I should say Christine and Paul, I got a typo in there, that were born here. So David Moore is my great uncle. And so this is a family photo that came from that. However, when he came here, pretty soon Christine was born, not long after that. And you'll notice a familiar thing here. Christine has pictures, the whole family has pictures of living in the trailers. And eventually Paul was born and they moved to an apartment at some point along the way. But he stayed here through his undergrad, finished his undergrad in 3.5 years with 2 kids, and then went on to law school. He didn't finish law school because he had to get a job to afford 2 kids and all these sort of things that went with it. But it's funny, I was looking at this picture and I was looking at the map of the trailer court, and I can pretty squarely triangulate exactly where this picture was taken, because if you look in the background, you can see the stadium, you can see the fence line where it's got the number 14 on it right there that's outside of that, and if you look at the map, there's really only 2 trailers that sort of fit that location, which means that she is actually sitting on the track. That is the extension that ran outside of the stadium that she's sitting on there. So all of these culture pieces, these extraordinary efforts, was an extraordinary change in the university that happened during that time. We not just doubled the enrollment, we literally changed the culture from start to finish. And we also spawned this idea that for about 30 years existed where we wanted to build more housing and we wanted to take care of students on campus. Now, eventually, we couldn't build enough housing to keep up with as quick as the student body was expanding. And off-campus housing is kind of our thing now, and about 3/4 of our students, a little more, live off campus. But for many years, that was part of the vision of what the university would be. You look back at things like racial integration and gender integration, many of the sort of quiet landmarks that happened with this came during this era when the veterans were coming back and saying, I'm not going to listen to Joe College. I'm not going to listen to Joe Dean of Men that says I can't live with my fellow veterans. I'm going to go and take my classes wherever I wanted. My other favorite piece that comes out of this, the veterans were known for messing up the grade curves in classes. And not in the way that you might think, right? So this idea that they were straight A's, a lot of them weren't. A lot of them just wanted to graduate. They wanted to learn what they wanted to learn. And so if they got a C and they still graduated, that's fine. It doesn't matter, right? And so all of a sudden, the traditional Joe College students would be in the class and they would be like, hey, everybody in this class is getting a C. I'm the only one that's getting an A. This should totally, boost my curve. I should, really be knocking it out of the park. And faculty stopped grading on curves because there were so many veterans that didn't care if they got a C. And this wasn't just an IU thing. I've read about this in comments from faculty of the time, but I've read about it in books about the time period as well across the country, that this idea that don't take life too seriously, don't take college too seriously. Include who you want, be friends with who you want, take the classes you want, get the degree and move on. That really became a part of the ethos of the university after this point, largely through the injection of this veteran mentality.
I have a few questions.
Yeah, I have some questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Sure.
I know the answer to this one, but I also want all 3 of you to weigh in
Yeah.
for the permanent record. Are there any trailers in Woodlawn Court or any other courts, or and if there's still in existence in Monroe County or anywhere you know of? Like,
I've spent over 10 years trying to find one. And have now what I often get when this comes up, my favorite place, if you ask this question, I learned this lesson, I've done it twice, I've stopped doing it. Monroe County History Club. If you bring this up, you'll have 5 people raise their hand and go, well, so-and-so used to have one out on the corner of blah, 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 and blah. And by so-and-so used to have one, that was at least 20 years ago that it was out there. And it's not there any longer. And so I have not even found the remnants of one or the pieces of one anywhere. I'm sure there are remnants of one that somebody turned into a hunting shed somewhere, but I've not found them.
Yeah, you know, it's okay, but,
Yeah.
and then also, obviously, I imagine this is an issue, well, it was an issue all across the country for universities, and I'm sure trailer courts are a very common way to deal with that, but were there any other unique ways of dealing with housing for veterans that you know of, or that, you know?
Yeah, so some universities had more capacity in their housing to expand. So probably the best example of this is today Collins Living Learning Center houses about 600 folks. When any given year, when the Navy ran it as a training barracks during World War II, they fit 1,300 people in the same space. Yeah, they put four beds, 2 bunk beds in every room. That today may just be a single, right? So a lot of schools went with those options. They simply put bunk beds in every room. They added on to things. They converted spaces like the townhouse into. There's an unsubstantiated fact that I've read several times that Ward Biddle and IU were responsible for the 2nd largest number of military surplus building purchases of any college in the country. And I don't know how to substantiate that. Like, I don't know how you would prove that. But supposedly Michigan beat us out. But, you know, we really went full in on military surplus housing that was going to be temporary. Although some of the trailers lasted into the 90s, it was going to be temporary. So that was our way to go about it.
Did we use Quonset huts for the same thing, or did we use Quonset huts for other things?
Quonset huts often became classrooms and extra storage buildings or offices, those type of things, just due to the flexibility of the space. There definitely were some that were used as housing. I say that only because I've seen some fragmentary pictures of things that I'm pretty sure, like, that's a bed through the door that I can see in there. But for the most part, I think most of them were used for classroom buildings. Because we also had to expand our classrooms. The other, we also implemented Saturday classes after the war, just to accommodate, somebody's got to go to class on Saturday just because we can't offer enough sections of English 101 if you don't take a class on Saturday, because there's just not enough classroom spaces. So we did that for many years as well.
I have a question about disabled veterans. I would imagine that there's a significant number of the veterans who are coming back who are disabled or physically impaired, and I'm just thinking, like, how, like, they're probably not going to live in Woodlawn because there's not a sidewalk.
Correct. Yep.
That's not gravel.
Yep.
So I'm like, do we have any idea of, like, where disabled veterans would be, like, this is our most accessible housing, or is that something that, like, would probably be taken care of off campus at, like, a boarding house or something like that?
I don't have a great answer to that. And ironically, I have an alum that constantly asks me that, which is usually what spawns half my research that I do. That particular alum came here in the late 70s and was part of the Vietnam era Disabled American Veterans chapter on campus that actually fought for most of the ADA accommodations that we have today. And they have stories about in the 1970s, they would have veterans that there weren't elevators in a lot of the buildings, and veterans would have a class on the 2nd floor, and they would make a big show of other veterans showing up and picking him up in his wheelchair and carrying him to the 2nd floor, and at the end of class coming back and picking him up and carrying him down again so that he could get to his next class. And this was part of the campaign to get ADA accommodations on campus. By and large, unfortunately, in that era, if you were in a wheelchair, you probably weren't going to college. That just wasn't the way the system was set up. Now, notable exception, and it's tough on me to say something nice about another Big Ten school, but the University of Illinois really led the country during this time. And they actually set up a program with the Navy Hospital in Chicago where veterans that were still undergoing rehab and still recovering were able to come there and go to campus. And they set up things that we would think of as normal today, like special buses that they could get loaded on to get moved around campus. They put in curb cuts. They let them schedule all of their classes so they could be on the first floor of buildings. And if they weren't, they would move that class, trade it with another class so that they could put it on they did a lot of those sort of things. They were really on the cutting edge of that ADA accommodation at World War II that we really didn't do until the 1970s. I've never seen a photograph. And this is a good question to ask the archives or Brad. I've never seen a photograph or heard of reference to someone in a wheelchair taking classes until the 1970s.
Wow.
So, yeah. And even then, it took us 10 years to really get some semblance of ADA accommodation as we know it today.
Yeah. I was just looking like the veterans in those pictures look very able-bodied.
Yes.
And
yep.
healthy. And I was just like, somebody's got to be missing a limb or like
Yep.
something, Yeah. I don't know.
Very good question.
There was something I wanted to ask about the Golden Book. Oh, okay. So you said that in the Golden Book that there were like biographies and like inputs. Okay. Are you in charge of those biographies and like fact checking?
Yeah, I did.
Like I'm just thinking like, somebody can submit like their uncle or something,
Yes.
and then just be like, my uncle was a veteran. He was also Superman and also single-handedly did this, and it's just like, he might have told you that, but in reality.
So there's two answers to that.
Okay.
The first answer is for the digital edition, for what we call Volume 2, everybody that we're adding since World War II. So when they fill out the form, we go through. I look at it. If I don't know anything about that military branch of service, or I can't quite fact check that, I'll get a hold of someone who can. Was there a super master technical sergeant in the Air Force at that time? Because I've never heard that title before. We'll get the military side covered on that. On the university side, we check them with the registrar's office to make sure that they were enrolled and they were a student. It's a little harder with employees because we don't always have HR records from that far back, but we can very often find references to them in the records and we can sort of vouch for it from there. So yes, those are all verified. Now, the problem is the actual written ones that are in there for World War II and back. There are some very glaring sort of technical errors in there about things that didn't happen or people that weren't maybe as involved in the way that it says they're involved. And most of the bio info that's in the actual written book is for gold stars, for people that died in service. So sometimes there was just bad information. The university they heard this person died and they heard this is what happened, and we go back and look at it and it's like, that's not exactly how they died. And so they probably shouldn't, at least needs corrected in the book. There's a woman veteran who died in World War I that's in the book, and we went back in 2013 and we added World War I women. It's a long story as to how they had gotten overlooked, but we found some of them that needed to be added to the book, and it's the only time we've gone back and actually added to the written book people because they were World War I and they should have been in there. And you read some accounts and it says that she died of appendicitis. You read other accounts and it says she died of pneumonia or she died of disease, and it's not real specific. And so we sort of genericized it and said she died at a hospital. She was a nurse and she was working at the hospital, and so we were like, let's err on the side of not putting them. Yeah, that was true. She did. Yeah. The other challenge with the Golden Book is that the phrasing that was used for it is the sons and daughters of Indiana University who served in the wars of the Republic. That does not specify which side you were on in said war. And this allowed for the Confederate alumni to be included in it for the Civil War. And even more so, it allowed for one German alumni who served in the German army during World War II to be included in the book. So, you know, it sort of struggles with what that means in that case. Ironically, that one German soldier I actually was able to find in the records of the German government, and I wrote their version of the VA, and they actually sent me his entire file. And then I had to get it translated, but we have lots of people on campus that could help with that, you know, and so I was trying to figure out, like, how did he even sort of end up in the book in the first place? How did we know? So he actually came here on an exchange program. In the late 1930s, we had a number of exchange programs where we would send a student to a country and then another student would come back here. And basically what they do is they would quite literally swap places. So if you were in Alpha 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 fraternity and you got the exchange program and got sent to that country, the person that came over from that country would live in Alpha 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 fraternity, like in your room, in your like space. Yeah, like it was, yeah, and that was kind of how these programs ran. The university would then grant you tuition as a part of this exchange program. And it was really pretty low cost for folks to do this. In some cases, I've read about people who went to Germany or England or places like that, and they actually lived with like their exchange person's parents. You know, they literally moved into somebody's childhood room, and they were like, "Okay, I'm your son now." You know, and I don't speak your language. I'm still working on it, but so there's a lot of sort of things that were a little interesting about the way things were done back then. Our campus records do refer to him as the Nazi that came from Germany, which is a little troubling in retrospect. Now, whether or not, I've never established whether he was an actual member of the Nazi Party or if that was just like how they were referring to him or whatever. But so he was here in 38, went back in 39, was immediately put into the German army, and ended up dying on the Eastern Front fighting Russia. So. But so yeah, so the Golden Book is the Golden Book. It's a document. It's a record. Is it a place of honor? Does that sort of make some challenges out of it? Maybe. I like to think of it more as a starting point for many of the conversations about the places IU has been and not been in history. So.
Does it include the dishonor pages?
The volume 2, the decision was made when we restarted in 2008 that we would consider the category of discharge, not that having a dishonorable discharge automatically prevented you from being in it. There's more nuance to the category of discharge and why you got that. At the time, this was when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was starting to end, and the effort was we want to include folks who eventually are going to get their reason for discharge changed. So people that were kicked out in 1999 for being gay could then appeal that. Come 2010, 2011, they could start appealing those things, and they would get that discharge changed to honorable or general, depending on what happened and why. Also, with the prevalence of PTSD in the Iraq and Afghanistan generation, a number of folks received dishonorable discharges because of behavior issues that they were experiencing along with the PTSD. We didn't want to keep them out. We wanted to be able to sort of handle that as well and have a means for people to appeal that based on what their discharge was. Yeah.
Just black and white.
Yeah.
All these
Yeah.
nuances,
Yeah. Well, the women of World War I that were left out, not that these nuances are even new, they were left out because according to the Department of Defense and the VA, women were not in the military in World War I. They were with the military in World War I. Despite the fact they might have uniforms and be deployed overseas and they might be in combat zones and at least one of them was killed, they weren't in the military. The ones that were closest to the front lines were very often nurses, either with the Red Cross or the YMCA or any of those sort of groups that were over there working behind the front lines. but they were considered part of the expeditionary force, even though they were on the front lines. There's a woman alum named Mary Sample, I always remember her name, who has a great letter that she wrote when she was trying to find out if she should qualify to be in the book. Registrar wrote her and said, well, were you sworn in to the military? And she replies back and she says, well, I was sworn at, sworn near, sworn around, may have even swore myself a little bit. I don't remember if I was actually sworn in. So.
That's cute.
Anyways, shoot me an email if you.
Yeah.
Yeah, my email's up here, my phone number's up here. This is my office line. If you ever have a question, you're ever not sure about something, feel free to reach out to me. I get a lot of random IU history questions from both folks on and off campus. I love it when folks go, hey, I want to know if my, great-grandfather is, in the Golden Book or whatever. Many of the folks that are in the Golden Book in the original written form, we have additional documentation on. All the way back to World War I, where they actually filled out a form, handwritten, where they said, this is what I did during the war. And so sometimes those are great things for families to be able to look back at and, oh, look, here's the handwriting of my great-great-grandfather and, those sort of things. And sometimes there's additional information in there about what they did as well.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much.
Yep, no problem.